I never expected a peaceful night at the pier to be the moment my life started spiraling out of control. I was just an ordinary guy with a wife back home, a steady job, and a predictable routine. Nothing about my life was flashy or exciting, but I liked it that way, or at least I thought I did. That night, my buddies and I were hanging out by the water, passing time like we always did. The salty breeze carried the sound of waves gently crashing against the wooden posts, and laughter from nearby tourists filled the air. We had a couple of beers, shared some old stories, and watched the sun sink below the horizon. And then I saw her. She was sitting alone on a bench at the end of the pier, her back to the crowd. A woman like her didn't belong here, or at least, not alone. Her dark hair tumbled over her shoulders, and even from a distance, I could tell she was stunning. But what drew me in wasn't her beauty. It was the way she stared out at the ocean, her shoulders slumped, her hand wiping at her face. She was crying. I should have looked away. I should have ignored it and gone back to my friends. But something in me wouldn't let that happen. Without thinking, I told the guys I'd be right back and made my way toward her. My footsteps were soft against the wooden boards as I approached, not wanting to startle her. When I got closer, I noticed the delicate jewelry on her wrists, the sleek designer bag resting by her side. She was well-dressed, too well-dressed for this part of town. "Hey, you okay?" I asked gently. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes wide and glassy. For a second, she looked like she was deciding whether to tell me to get lost. "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaky. She turned back to the water as if to dismiss me, but I didn't leave. "Doesn't seem that way," I replied, leaning against the railing next to her. "I know you don't know me, but if you want to talk, I'm a good listener. Sometimes strangers are easier to open up to." She sighed, wiping her face again. "It's stupid," she mumbled, "and I'm embarrassed enough already." "Try me," I said. "I've heard plenty of stupid things in my life." That earned me a small laugh, a soft, broken sound, but it was a start. "My name's Lila," she said after a pause. "And you?" "Nick," I replied, offering a small smile. What started as an awkward conversation soon turned into something deeper. She opened up a little, explaining that she was frustrated with her life, her marriage, and everything in between. "I feel trapped," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I thought marrying him would make me happy, but it hasn't. It's like I'm living in a golden cage. I didn't pry into who he was. I just listened, and the more she spoke, the more I realized how lonely she really was. Her vulnerability pulled me in, and before I knew it, I wasn't just comforting her. I was captivated by her. When she finally smiled at one of my jokes, it felt like a victory. The evening ended with her thanking me, saying she hadn't laughed that much in a long time. She left before I could offer to walk her to her car, and I figured that was the end of it. Just a chance encounter with a stranger I'd never see again. But 2 days later, I got a text from an unknown number. "Hey, it's Lila. Thanks for listening the other night. I don't usually open up to people like that. Would you want to grab coffee sometime?" My treat. I stared at the message for a long time, debating whether I should respond. Part of me knew it wasn't a good idea. I was married, and even though nothing had happened, meeting her again felt like stepping onto dangerous ground. But I told myself it was innocent. Just coffee. When we met up at a small cafe by the waterfront, she looked even more radiant than I remembered. She wore a flowy dress that hugged her in all the right places, her hair falling in loose waves. I tried not to stare too much, but it was impossible not to notice how heads turned as she walked in. We talked for hours, about life, work, and dreams we hadn't chased. She confessed that she used to love painting but had stopped after her marriage. I shared how I used to play guitar before life got too busy. We laughed about small things and vented about bigger ones. It wasn't until our second coffee date that she dropped the bombshell. "I'm married to Jonathan Rivera," she said casually, as if it weren't a name that carried weight. I blinked. "The Jonathan Rivera? The real estate tycoon?" She nodded, sipping her latte like it was no big deal. "He's not the man people think he is." I didn't know what to say. Everyone in our town knew who he was. The man had his face plastered on billboards and his name on half the luxury buildings downtown. He was the kind of guy who could buy his way out of any situation, and it hit. Me then, Lila wasn't just any woman. She was his wife. That must be complicated, I said cautiously. You have no idea, she replied, her gaze dropping to the table. He doesn't love me. He loves controlling me. This wasn't just some casual coffee meetup anymore. I was sitting across from a woman trapped in a world I couldn't even begin to understand. She was drowning, and for some reason, she'd chosen me to confide in. Before I could stop myself, I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. You deserve better, I said softly. Her fingers trembled beneath mine, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at me with eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe, or desperation. Either way, it made my chest tighten. I don't want to feel this way anymore, she whispered. We stayed like that for a moment, locked in something neither of us fully understood yet. I knew what this looked like. I knew what it could turn into if I wasn't careful, but the more time I spent with her, the less I cared about logic or caution. As we left the cafe that afternoon, she hesitated by her car. Nick, she said softly, biting her lip, I know this is going to sound strange, but I want to see you again. Not just for coffee. My heart raced. I should have said no. I should have walked away right then and there. But instead, I nodded. Okay, she smiled. A genuine, beautiful smile that made me feel like I was the only person who'd ever made her happy. I'll text you, she said before driving off. As I watched her taillights disappear, I felt the weight of what I'd just agreed to settle heavily on my chest. This wasn't just a simple connection anymore. This was the start of something dangerous, and deep down, I knew I was already in too deep. I thought about her constantly. After that afternoon at the cafe, it was like something inside me had snapped. I couldn't focus at work. My wife Megan asked me twice if I was feeling sick because I was so distracted during dinner. I brushed it off, telling her I was just stressed from work. But the truth gnawed at me. I had never done anything like this before. I wasn't the kind of man who got caught up in someone else's life, someone else's chaos. But with Lila, it felt different. It wasn't just infatuation or the excitement of something new. She made me feel needed, like I was the missing piece to a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for years. When her text came later that night, my heart pounded. Lila, I can't stop thinking about you. I stared at my phone, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. The logical side of me was screaming to stop, to delete her number, to go to bed and pretend none of this ever happened. But the other side, the one that craved her, won. Me. Same here. When can I see you again? Her response came quickly. Lila, tomorrow, my place, 8 p.m. Jonathan's out of town for the weekend. I didn't even hesitate. Me. I'll be there. The next day dragged on endlessly. My thoughts were a blur, replaying our conversations and the way her hand had felt in mine. By the time 7:30 p.m. hit, I was already out the door. Megan thought I was meeting a friend for drinks. But instead, I was driving towards something I couldn't explain or control. When I pulled into her long driveway, the house stood tall and silent, bathed in the warm glow of porch lights. My palms were clammy as I walked to the door, but before I could knock, it opened. There she was. She wasn't dressed in anything extravagant, just a simple fitted sweater and leggings, but she looked more breathtaking than ever. Her hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her face lit up when she saw me. Hey, she said, her voice soft and uncertain. Hey, I replied, my voice lower than I intended. We stood there for a moment, the silence heavy between us. I wanted to say something, anything, but before I could, she reached out and wrapped her arms around me. The hug caught me off guard, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I tightened my grip around her, holding her like she was something fragile. I could feel her breath against my neck, warm and shaky. I've been waiting for this, she whispered. Me too, I admitted. She pulled back slightly, her face just inches from mine. Her eyes searched mine, and before I knew it, she leaned in, pressing her lips against mine. The kiss was soft at first, testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, and before I knew it, my hands were on her waist, pulling her closer. She led me into the living room, and we collapsed onto the couch, lost in the moment. The world outside didn't exist, just her warmth, her touch, and the way she clung to me like I was her lifeline. As the minutes passed, the weight of what we were doing started creeping in. My thoughts spiraled. Images of Megan, our home, everything I was risking. But then Lila pulled back and rested her forehead against mine. "You're thinking too much," she said softly, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. "How can I not?" I whispered. "This isn't who I am." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eyes. "It's not about who you were yesterday, it's about what you feel right now." Her words sank in, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. She wasn't asking for forever, just this moment. And for reasons I couldn't explain, that felt like enough. We spent the rest of the evening talking, curled up on the couch as the rain pattered softly against the windows. She told me about her childhood, how she used to dream of becoming an artist before life got in the way. I shared stories of my teenage years, back when I thought playing guitar in a garage band would make me famous. Somewhere between our laughter and shared memories, she rested her head on my shoulder and sighed. "With you, it feels like I can breathe again." I didn't respond, but I tightened my arm around her, silently acknowledging what we both felt but couldn't say out loud. As the night wore on, I knew I should leave, but every time I tried to pull away, she'd hold me tighter. "Stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just for tonight." I hesitated, my heart pounding. "Lila, please," she cut me off, her eyes pleading. "Don't leave me alone." I exhaled, my resolve crumbling. "Okay." We fell asleep on the couch, her body tucked against mine. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But as the early morning light crept through the windows, reality came crashing back in. I slipped out from under her gently, careful not to wake her. As I grabbed my jacket and headed toward the door, guilt gnawed at my chest. What had I just done? Before I could make it to the door, her soft voice stopped me. "Nick?" I turned to see her sitting up, the blanket draped over her shoulders, her hair messy and her eyes half closed. She looked fragile, like someone who'd been through too much and was afraid of what would happen next. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. She shook her head. "Don't be." She stood up and walked over to me, placing her hand on my chest. "This doesn't have to be complicated. Just don't forget what tonight meant." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I won't." With one last, "Look." I opened the door and stepped out into the cool morning air. As I walked to my car, my mind raced with everything I had to face when I got home. Megan, my marriage, the lie I had just told. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as waves of guilt and longing crashed over me. I knew this wasn't over. I didn't want it to be over. But I also knew that continuing down this path would destroy everything I'd built. And yet, as I drove away from her house, the only thing I could think about was when I'd see her again. The message came on a Wednesday afternoon right when I was finishing up some reports at work. My phone buzzed with a notification, and I assumed it was Megan asking me to pick up something from the store on my way home. But when I saw the name on the screen, my heart dropped. Unknown number. We need to talk. Tonight. My office. 8 p.m. There was no name, but I didn't need one. I knew exactly who it was. Jonathan Rivera. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first instinct was to block the number, pretend I never saw it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. He had found out. There was no way he hadn't, not if he was texting me directly. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, barely able to focus on anything. My hands trembled as I typed out emails, and when my boss stopped by my desk to ask if everything was okay, I forced a smile and told him I was just tired. Inside, though, I was unraveling. By the time 7:30 rolled around, I was sitting in my car in the parking lot outside Jonathan's office building, debating whether or not to go inside. Maybe I should have just driven home, confessed everything to Megan, and braced for the fallout. But the thought of her face when she found out made my stomach churn. I couldn't lose her. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The building was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, just like you'd expect from a man like Jonathan. The receptionist didn't even ask who I was. She just gave me a knowing look and gestured toward the elevator. When I stepped into his office, Jonathan was already sitting behind a massive oak desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked amused. "Nick," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Right on time." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "You wanted to see me?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." I obeyed, my legs feeling like lead as I lowered myself into the seat. The room was cold, the air conditioning humming softly in the background. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching me like a predator sizing up its prey. "You've been spending a lot of time with my wife," he finally said, his tone casual. I didn't respond. What could I say? Denying it would only make things worse. He chuckled, setting the glass down on the desk. "Relax, Nick. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not even mad." I blinked, confused. "You're not?" "No." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "See, Lila's always been a bit restless. I knew it was only a matter of time before she found someone else to keep her entertained. I just didn't expect it to be someone like you." The way he said it, like I was some insignificant speck, made my skin crawl. "I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smirked. "Of course you didn't. None of them do." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights below. "You're probably wondering why I called you here, right? If I'm not going to ruin your life or call your wife, then what's the point?" I didn't answer, but my silence was enough. He turned back to face me, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to see the man who thought he could take something that belonged to me." The words hit me like a punch. To the gut. "Lila's not a thing," I said, my jaw clenching. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You really think you were special to her, don't you? Let me guess. She told you she felt trapped, that you made her feel alive again. She probably even cried in front of you." He shook his head, as if he'd heard it all before. "She's good at that." I felt sick. Every memory of Lila, the late-night texts, the stolen moments, now felt tainted, like I'd been played without even realizing it. "You're lying," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure. I believed them, am I? He walked back to his desk and picked up his glass, taking a long sip. "Look, I'm not here to make you feel bad. If anything, I should be thanking you. You kept her busy while I focused on things that actually matter." He set the glass down and leaned in, his eyes boring into mine. "But let me give you a piece of advice. Don't get attached to women like Lila. They'll chew you up and spit you out before you even realize what's happening." My hands tightened into fists, but I stayed silent. What was the point of arguing with him? He'd already won. As if sensing my defeat, he smirked and leaned back in his chair. "Anyway, I'm done here. You're free to go. And don't worry, I won't be telling your wife, not because I care about you, but because Lila begged me not to." I stood up, my legs shaky. "Why would she do that?" He shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe she actually did care about you, in her own twisted way." He paused, his smirk widening. "Or maybe she just didn't want the drama. Either way, you should consider yourself lucky." I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, he called out one last time. "Oh, and Nick?" I stopped, but didn't turn around. "I hope you enjoyed playing with my toy." His voice was dripping with sarcasm, and it took everything in me not to turn around and punch him. I left without another word, the sound of his laughter echoing in my ears as I made my way to the elevator. The drive home was a blur. My thoughts were racing, each one more self-destructive than the last. How had I let things get this far? How had I allowed myself to risk everything for a woman who, according to her own husband, saw me as nothing more than a temporary distraction? When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as guilt washed over me. Megan's car was parked in its usual spot, and the porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front yard. I couldn't lose this. I couldn't lose her. That night, as I crawled into bed next to Megan, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. For her, for our life, for the stability I had taken for granted. I wrapped my arm around her waist, pulling her close. She stirred slightly, but instead of pushing me away, she nestled deeper into my embrace. I didn't deserve her forgiveness. Hell, she didn't even know what I'd done. But lying there with her in the dark, I made a silent promise to be better. I stopped responding to Lila's texts after that. She tried a few times, apologies, late-night messages about how much she missed me, but I never replied. Eventually, she stopped reaching out, and I blocked her number. The guilt didn't disappear overnight. It lingered, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. But instead of letting it consume me, I used it as a reminder of what I almost lost. Sometimes I think about what Jonathan said, about how I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. Maybe he was right. But in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I had gotten out before it destroyed my life. I'll never forget Lila, or the way she made me feel. But I'm not grateful for the affair. I'm grateful for the wake-up call. Because sometimes, it takes almost losing everything to realize what you had all along. What do you think about this? Did I do the right thing by cutting ties with Lila and saving my marriage, or should I have fought for the woman who made me feel alive again? Was it fear that held me back, or was it the realization that I already had everything I needed at home? Let me know in the comments. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have walked away or stayed and fought for something forbidden?